Today, today I want to remember Christine Cotton. She's a French whistleblower who sadly passed away on the 2nd of June 2026. I did not know her. I was not following her, and I feel as though I have lost something by not knowing about her stance because I probably would have agreed or understood where she was coming from. She reminds me of Gert van den Bosch, who I've interviewed on a number of occasions and I hope to speak to again, as someone who's taken a stance, whether or not you agree with them. They have sacrificed everything in order to protect what they think is humanity. And this is the reality of where we are now. As I said, you don't have to agree with someone, but when you see someone risk it all for the sake of a point, you must, at minimum, take them seriously. And in order to understand who she was, I've gone through all the details and I've tried to summarize things. And this is who she was in terms of her background. She was a biostatistician, and so she spent many years looking at clinical trials and the like, and had a lot of expertise in this area. Almost, I think, 25 years of pharmaceutical research. She had her own organization, clinical research. She worked with big pharmaceutical industry companies. She had reviewed and analyzed hundreds of clinical trials. She knew how to design trials, how to analyze them, how to look at compliance. And she then was independently reviewing the vaccine trial data. And this is where it became a problem because her perspective was different from what everyone else was being told. Now, because I've listened to Gert since May, the risk of mass vaccination in the midst of a pandemic and the pressure that would happen on the virus, and everything made perfect sense, but he was not listened to either. And the implications are that when someone, and this is the point that I'm realizing, it is easy to stay silent. And for those of you who are listening, just remember this. We have all come across situations where we could or should have done something. And for whatever reason, we may not have done anything. And what you must then be able to recognize is that when somebody takes a stance that comes at a risk to their career, to their finance, you have to take them seriously. The amount of times that whistleblowers have been completely decimated is unbelievable, and we need to learn from it and try and protect them from the harm that comes. Now, I had my own experience with raising awareness, and if you're listening here, you're one of the few. If you look at my, well, you wouldn't know in terms of my reach, it has been down almost probably 95%. And I put it back to when I did this particular presentation. It was censored on YouTube. And at that time, it just completely destroyed my reach, which has never really recovered. And at that time, I did a reanalysis of the original trial and I looked in detail at the causes of death in both groups, the placebo and the vaccinated group, and I highlighted some particular patterns. And boy, did they come down on this with a barge pole, so to speak. If you want to look at it, it's still on my Substack. You can look in the description. I don't think I would put it up again because of the risks. But the point is that when there are some things, it seems that you are not allowed to touch. Okay. So let's just quickly go through what Christine was saying that caused so much problems with her and industry. And I had to reflect carefully and see whether or not I understood or agreed with what she was saying. So her perspective, specifically looking at the Pfizer rollout, was that she was concerned that the manufacturing process differed between process one and process two. So when they were doing the initial batches of vaccines, the process that they use for that would likely be different from when they have to produce millions of doses. And so she was arguing that the strategy or the checks and balances should be in place as well for process two as it was for process one. Now, I happen to speak with Headley Rees as well, who is into the regulation and the blockchain about how products are brought to market. And he was saying it was virtually impossible to do the testing on process two at that size and that scale, because what he was saying is that when you do the first lot on a small scale, say phase one or phase two, and you do your process to get the vaccine, when you are trying to then do that, instead of for say 40,000 people, you're now trying to do it for 500,000 people. That's a different process because you have to scale it up. And so he was saying that you needed to recheck it to see whether or not the safety was there for process two as was there for process one. That's very similar to what Christine was arguing. Now, the industry, because she took this to court, they disagreed, and the regulatory position was that yes, there were manufacturing changes, they're common, but there was no particular problem that they found. Additionally, when they were looking at the bridging data between the original trial and subsequently, she didn't think it was sufficient, and she's doing this from a trial analysis position. The regulators said no, they thought comparable studies were performed and they were satisfied. And because she believed this, she thought that the commercial product was inadequately tested. However, all of the big regulators said no, they thought that everything was sufficiently comparable. So what happens here is a different in perspective. I think what she was saying is that if she was running these trials, she would have put a halt to certain things in order to make sure that it was followed through. Now, you have to remember we were in a pandemic. And so in terms of speed of getting to a product, the truth is that yes, you had to cut corners. And I think regulators should be able to be honest about that, because there's no way that you can do the same thing in such a short time frame without having to cut corners. So you just have to be honest about it and open and say, okay, yeah, we did, but as best as we could, we followed the safety recommendations. That's a probably more honest answer. Now, she disagreed with that point, and as I said, she took it to court. I don't think she won the case, but she was that strongly advocating about this that she was willing to go to court on it. That is a pretty serious whistleblower. So I then took a look at some more other points in terms of largely and broadly what her thinking was, because here's what can happen is that somebody can have, say, 4 or 5 points, of which 1 point is wrong or not right, or they've gone off on a tangent, but the others are correct. What then happens is that the scientific community will disregard everything because they say that 1 point was wrong. Now, if we use that same standard when we're thinking about, say, COVID vaccines, After you were told 2 doses and it would be over, then 3, then 4, you would have completely disregarded everything that the experts were saying. So if you don't allow some degree of leeway for your critics, how can you expect the same leeway for yourself? That's part of the problem. So let's look in more detail at some of her primary trial concerns. She thought that there was not enough follow-up, limited long-term safety and efficacy. Now, this is blatantly obvious, meaning that you can't do long-term in the short term, no matter what you think. We are only just starting to reach long-term, so there is no long-term safety and efficacy. So we are hoping that this is okay. Just be honest. She didn't think that some of the cases were unconfirmed. She suspected large numbers of cases were not PCR confirmed, and she probably was right. How we prove it, I don't know. She had questions about the actual trial conduct and the consistency of the data from the protocols. She's an expert. Again, that's something that regulators should be able to answer. 4, this, a placebo crossover. Now, this is, I don't know if people understand this, but what happened is that the cohort who were the placebo were then given the vaccine because they determined that it was so safe and so effective that it would be unethical for them not to get the vaccine. Now, the problem is when you do that, you suddenly have no idea in terms of longer term outcomes. Now, I understand what they were saying, but that is a biggie. I mean, she is right. You can't then know the comparison long term between the placebo and the vaccinated cohort because you then went and vaccinated all of them. So suddenly your long term data is now virtually impossible. I understand why they made the argument for it, but should it have been done? Were they so confident in the science? We'll see. Additionally, she was concerned about Ventavia. There was a whistleblower who came out who was involved in some of the trial sites. Now, this was a smaller number of sites out of the, say, 40,000. But she had said that they didn't follow practices and protocol. And this could have impacted on the outcomes because, as I said, when you look carefully at the outcomes, because what I did when I did the reanalysis, when I had the full data set, I shifted the end date from the 14th of November to the 30th of December. Now, because there was a time pressure for the vaccine, they needed to get it to the public as quickly as they could. They tried to shorten that time as much as possible. So my question was very simple. Well, what happens if you had stayed the course and done a longer period of assessment instead of the 14th of November, which was your cutoff? What happens if that cutoff was the 30th of December? You have to look in the article. I don't even know if I can talk about it, but very clearly, if the 30th of December had been used as the cutoff, it would have been a completely different conversation. And that's from their own data. And I'm just saying, you can shoot the messenger, as that's happened here with Christine Cotton. But the facts are the facts. Additionally, transmission data. Again, this was a big one. Limited evidence on preventing infection and spread. I mean, I knew from day one that an injectable vaccine couldn't stimulate mucosal immunity effectively. And so therefore, even if you had some reduction of transmission, it would simply be because you had elevated levels of IgG in the bloodstream. So it's more of a leakage of antibodies. But as soon as that comes down, there is no benefit. And actually, in longer term, you may have skewed the immune system. But that's a whole different conversation. The point being that we didn't have adequate data on that to analyze it properly. And so they just ran with the information and therefore rolled it out to the public. Again, I can't disagree with her. I don't know who is disagreeing with her on these points, to be frank with you, because these are pretty straightforward points. The final one was special population, limited data in the pregnant, immune compromised, and high risk groups. We're only starting to get data. Say, for instance, I recently looked at a study looking at people who were on immune suppressants after kidney transplants. And this proportion of them don't respond to the vaccine, and they don't have a good mucosal response either. But this is 2026. We're only getting this data. So they had at the time limited data in pregnancy as well and other high risk groups. I mean, as I said, some of the decisions that were made were so outside the norm that I was thinking to myself, they are setting themselves up for a situation where they cannot fail. Why would you corner yourself like that? And so all of these points, I mean, a few of them are probably questionable. Say, for instance, unconfirmed COVID cases, I think would have been hard to do. But when I look at her main points here, I can't necessarily confirm about the deviations of the protocols. This was a whistleblower who did come out and say there were problems. Again, the regulators said it was okay. So, of the seven, definite, 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 questionable, outside of my expertise. This is not a whistleblower who was way off track. This is what I mean, is that this is somebody who is in the industry. I'm due to also talk to somebody again soon. Hopefully, Susan will be available in the next few weeks. And she's another person who has expertise in regulation of vaccines from industry. She's now retired, and so she can freely speak. She isn't afraid of being targeted from her job. This is usually why people are so anxious about speaking out. And I think she's doing a book on some of the points. So people are speaking out, but there are such small numbers that everybody is perceiving it's okay. When I spoke with Gert, and I asked him, so are you talking to colleagues, who you've worked with, who work in the industry? And quietly they agree that he's right, but they can't or they couldn't say anything about it because of the risk that it would have to their jobs. That's the reality. And don't judge people on it, because if you are working, this is why I'm saying I don't want people to judge people on staying silent, because people stay silent about all kinds of things. And as I said, if I really quizzed each individual person who is making a judgment, I'd probably find that there are areas where you've stayed silent yourself for whatever reason. Don't judge people for it, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't therefore listen when somebody comes forward with regards to information. Now, this case is very sad, and I'm going to read to you her last note, because I think that this is important for us to reflect on, and because the sad truth is that she didn't just die, but she took her own life, and that to me is the ultimate sacrifice for someone who is standing up for what they believe in. And for the reasons in this note, she then went forward with these actions. Let's reflect on carefully as to what she said. So this is the 2nd of June, 2026. And by the time you read these lines, I will have left the world. For those who do not know me, my name is Christine Cotton. I am what is known as a whistleblower. I've worked for 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry in the management and analysis of clinical data. As a biostatistician since December of 2020, I have immersed myself in the documents of the COVID vaccine from the Pfizer lab. I have written numerous documents and done many broadcasts to share the real results. My conclusions are catastrophic, beyond the invalidity of the results due to errors or even manifest frauds. The Pfizer vaccine that the population received that you may have received is not the one from the clinical trial with the 95% efficacy announced by all the politicians, journalists, and TV doctors. You are administered a product for which there were absolutely no results, neither of efficacy nor of tolerance. This message is not intended to create centralization on social networks, but to inform you of one of the biggest manipulations that humanity has ever known. All the evidence is in the latest version of my work, which I invite you to download and read. For the lazier ones and the very busy, the few pages of the conclusion and links to the source documents will already enlighten you a great deal. For somebody who was just about to pass away, that is very powerful words. Now, as I said, that is from her own research that hasn't been agreed by the regulators. Certainly, from my perspective with regards to the science, I've always been concerned about the impact with regards to the combination of immune priming and reinfections. That's as far as I will say. I'll not go down the road of whether or not the vaccine should have been used at all, largely because I think that if they hadn't and more people had died, all the politicians would have been shot. No, well, they would have been criticized too heavily anyway. So they had to do something. My point is that they should have focused on the high risk who had not been infected. I think if they had done that, the vaccine would not have had any significant questions and it would have been silence all around. Here is the final bit of this message from Christine. I fell ill. At that very moment, I filed a complaint against the health authorities. For over a year, I've been suffering from excruciating pain, starting from the lower back down to my legs, burning sensations to the skin, mainly in the legs and the back. I have consulted general practitioners, neurologists, osteopaths, virologists, dermatologists, rheumatologists, psychiatrists, homeopaths. I've swallowed thousands of capsules for dietary supplements, anxiolytics, neuroleptics, painkillers prescribed by the pain center. I have even done bioresonance sessions and seen magnetizer, and this without any result. Now, I want everyone here to reflect on something. I don't think she was vaccinated. So this is possibly more like a long COVID picture. And that's an assumption because I don't know the data. When people are suffering like this, whether it's from pure infection early in the pandemic where they had COVID and ended up with long COVID, or they had it directly from having a vaccine, which is also a cohort some people are not aware of, or the combination and they are struggling with this. This is an absolutely horrendous disease to manage. Please don't criticize those people who are suffering. I think that we have to find solutions for them. And that is the sad part. And that is a failure of medicine and science, that we haven't found solutions and people are willing to take their own lives or even use euthanasia in Canada. I think that that's a failure on our side, and we have to work harder to find solutions. Here is the final part of her message. I am at the end of what I can bear. I ask forgiveness from those who love me, you who have followed me on social networks for 4 years, my friends, my parents, and above all to God, or whatever his nature or name may be, to end my life. I, who have never ceased to protect it since childhood, whether plant, animal, or human life. From the bottom of my heart, I thank those who have supported me, encouraged me, and all those who pray or have organized prayer groups. I'm going to ask you to pray once more so that my soul may be in the light of the Creator as soon as possible. This is very, very powerful words, and what can I say? She sacrificed everything for what she thought or what she believed was protecting the world. This is Christine Cotton, who stood up against industry, who has now passed away on the 2nd of June, who represents a voice that we should all respect, whether or not we agree with her. I liken her to the French Goethe, somebody who stood everything to say what he believed was correct. And as I reflect on these people, we must remember that sometimes we have to be brave. And this applies to everyone who is listening, who is watching, because the world demands that sometimes you take a stand. The final point that I want to make is to the scientific community. And I'm just going to show the comments here while I talk. This is an important point. And this I saw just within a day of this presentation of learning about Christine's situation. This was put on Twitter after 8 billion doses. Yes, 8 billion, not a typo. COVID vaccines are at this point one of the most tested medical interventions in history and one of the safest ever. This has had 461,000 views from the 6th of June, 2,300 comments, 18,000 likes. But when I did an analysis of the comments, the vast majority are negative. Okay? And each comment has lots of likes. Now, whichever way you take this, from a scientific or a medical perspective, you cannot ignore what the public is saying. This is unbelievable, the amount of negative things that are being said about COVID vaccines. Anybody who ignores this, you're going to destroy our profession, trust in everything, because you believe more in an ideology than in science. As I said, the point that you have to reflect on is that because the whole world was not vaccinated, you have a huge cohort of people who are unvaccinated and seem to be absolutely fine. That is a problem for the narrative. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't people who should have been vaccinated. As I said, there was a cohort who was high risk, who had not been exposed. We knew who they were. They had the comorbidities. They were older. They were obese. We knew who they were. They were the ones who were vaccinated first. What happened afterwards, I cannot see the science in still today. And you may disagree, but the science just really was not there for a mass rollout across the population. Now, I don't know if I'm allowed to say things like that these days because, you know, some things you just can't say. I'm just looking at the science. I've been studying the science for 6 years now, published multiple papers. And I'm telling you that when I analyze it, I know what the sweet spot was. And the sweet spot was the high risk who didn't have exposure. If they had just done that, that's how they would have gotten this down as probably the greatest move in history. But by broadening it, they showed all the weaknesses and they exposed the public to reflect on what had happened. The negative association with vaccines broadly now is horrendous. This is why public health is now struggling for people to get vaccinated, because they destroyed the trust. As I said, trust is like glass. Once you break it, you can't just stick it back together. Anybody who needs to understand this, I would advise them to just go to this post and look at the comments. Just roll through them. Just scroll through the comments. This is what the public is saying. Whether or not you agree with them, they're the ones who have to agree with you. This is what they are saying across the board. 2,300 comments, and I cannot find a positive comment so far. That is unbelievable. That's just the reality. And so, as we remember, as I said, Christine did take a stand, and she represents a voice that I don't think should have been ignored. I think that it is critical for us to remember her work and her sacrifice. And I think that that's what I want to do today. I'm sorry I didn't know her. I hadn't followed her before. I wasn't aware of her work and her stance. But yes, I wish there were more people like her who are willing to make a stand. Thank you very much for watching. I haven't looked at any of the comments as such. I appreciate what you're saying. Thank you for speaking the truth so boldly. Yes, it is the truth, and there is still a lot of work that we need to do. And so thank you all for staying here, and keep talking, raise awareness, let people know about her sacrifice. That's probably the minimum that we can all do so that we can remember her life and her sacrifice and what she stood for. Have a great evening. Thank you all very much.